Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome back to Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and this is File 002, Epstein, The Reckoning, Part 2, The Cover-Up and Collapse. I don't have a whole lot to say up here up front. I just wanted to go ahead and welcome you guys back. I'm so glad that you chose to come back and finish up this series. We have 2 more episodes after this one, and each one is going to get progressively further down the rabbit hole and darker, and everything that goes with trying to, fully cover something as broad and in-depth as Epstein, his life, his network, his death, and everything that went along with it. I really hope that you guys are enjoying this so far. We've got a ton to get into tonight, as we will in all of the rest of these episodes. Part 1 was basically just kind of a refresher. I wanted to dig into his history, how he got to where he was when things really started to kind of come together and really build him into what the world came to know eventually. Like I said, not a lot else I want to get into. Don't want to waste your time, because we definitely have a lot to get through. So welcome back to File 002, Epstein, The Reckoning, Part 2, The Cover-Up and Collapse.
Welcome to Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 4.
I don't know, I guess I just had the ambition to talk to people this year, bring back the interview format. I also still try to do several deep dives and cover some topics that I've really been wanting to get to and never had a chance to. And I guess just hope that everybody's willing to come along for the ride. Before we dive into how the veneer fell off and how his crimes finally were able to surface, I just want to add one more item to Epstein's Bear Stearns years that may also point to intelligence ties. If you recall from the Octopus series, we discussed the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. Well, BCCI became infamous for fraud, money laundering, and covert-linked finance. Senate investigations would uncover deep CIA connections, as well as the bank's involvement with foreign intel agencies and Iran-Contra transactions and laundering, as well as relationships to intermediaries in the affair, such as Adnan Khashoggi and others that were associated with covert arms trafficking. BCCI was a major laundering and influence node, and its later collapse was much more than a regular bank scandal. Bear Stearns wasn't just an ordinary brokerage firm in this story either. It provided global clearing services and later became pivotal to the 2008 economic collapse that pulled it under. Recently released documents and investigative reporting by people like Mike Benz and Whitney Webb show that Bear Stearns cleared large volumes of BCCI-related trades and possibly serviced covert finance channels tied to Iran-Contra. A clearing service is basically just like a middle layer that matches, verifies, and finalizes a financial transaction before the actual money or securities or whatever move. Meaning, in this particular case, Bear Stearns was essentially key in not only approving the suspect BCCI transactions, but also co-signing them as being legit. Not only that, Bear Stearns also handled at least 1/3 of Capcom futures trading as well with BCCI. Capcom was 50% owned by Kamal Adham, who handled the money for the Mujahideen funds and armament pipeline whenever the CIA was paying Osama bin Laden, aka Tim Osman, to put together an organized group of Arab fighters in order to fight the Soviets and drive them from Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, of course, would go on to become Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. And guess who armed those guys, by the way? Douglas Leese, Epstein's mentor and international arms dealer, who he would spend a great deal of time with, along with Adnan Khashoggi and Stanley Pottinger, who would go on to share an office and an apartment with Epstein. All of these transactions were also flowing through, you guessed it, the CIA's bank BCCI. This is when Bear Stearns' commodities book would explode to $2 billion moving through it. Remember, the CIA was doing all of this off books so that the U.S. could keep plausible deniability and never officially sanction it. Saudi spy master Kamal Adam was also the spy master who led the Safari Club, which was a 5-nation covert op consortium that was capable of moving hundreds of millions of untraceable petrodollars into arms, real estate, commodity trades, and all of it outside of U.S. congressional oversight. Who was their bank? Yep, you guessed it, BCCI. Congrats, you've been paying attention. Now, how does Epstein factor in? Well, if anyone in the CIA network wanted to finance this sort of thing, but without revealing the U.S.'s role in it, they could just have Bear Stearns set up a book and move the money. One connection that Mike Benz mentions is that during this time, the Saudi spy master Kamal Adam was doing all of this, which would be right around 1982. Epstein was doing a Saudi oil deal. This is where that fake Saudi passport that was found inside of Epstein's giant wall safe. It was also dated from 82 to 87. This deal was handled by Pottinger and Lease as well. Although Epstein officially left Bear Stearns in 1981, he remained closely tied to the firm and its network, and he continued to benefit from its people, contacts, and credibility for years after, even answering his home phone where he took some of his business calls, answering the phone as Bear Stearns, as if he was still there. Now, let's tie all of this into what we've learned so far. Epstein's most useful skill at this point was his supposed ability to make funds sheltered from tax liability and virtually untraceable. He takes Adnan Khashoggi on as a client, and he has a fake Saudi passport and is supposedly doing Saudi oil deals alongside his close acquaintances, Pottinger and Lease, and he worked at Bear Stearns during the 79 to 80 time frame when they were handling the clearing of at least a third of BCCI's transactions. A fact that may actually help explain how Epstein was originally connected to the spy network of Lease, Pottinger, and Khashoggi. This would seem to possibly indicate that during 79, Epstein played some role in working on clearing the CIA's BCCI payments to arms dealers, Lease and Khashoggi, through Safari Club channels. It would certainly help explain why Lease took such a quick liking to Epstein, who aside from his potential to help disguise weapons payments at Bear Stearns, was otherwise unremarkable, and should never have met, much less become so close with Lease. This all hinges on whether or not Epstein worked on clearing BCCI trades at Bear Stearns, of course, but it would line up with whenever he was promoted to partner. Ace Greenberg, who opened up the accounts for the BCCI deals and was running the CIA money through it, he definitely brought Epstein in and mentored him there, and was instrumental in his early career and connections building. All of the pieces seem to line up, but like so many things with Epstein, the documentation needed to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt is impossible to get, at least for now. So for the time being, let's pivot back to where we left off in our last episode, and welcome back to Epstein, The Reckoning, Part 2, The Cover-Up and Collapse. While they haven't released a document that we can point to and say, hey, look, it's right there that Epstein worked for the Mossad or CIA or whatever, there's a great deal of tangential evidence and strong speculation that would seem to indicate that it was likely. Here's what we do know for a fact, and it's hard to ignore. Epstein strongly supported pro-Zionism causes, and he donated to Israeli groups like Friends of the IDF and settler organization, the Jewish National Fund. And he absolutely had close ties to members of Israel's overseas intel services. A memo produced by the FBI's LA field office, dated to October of 2020, reports that one of their sources had come to believe that Epstein was, quote, a co-opted Mossad agent. It would go on to claim that he was, quote, trained as a spy for Israel's intel services. In the same document, that's EFTA 000900314, the confidential human source goes on to say that Epstein maintained links to U.S. and allied intelligence circles through his longtime lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor whose network was said to include, quote, many students from wealthy families, and among those named were Jared Kushner and his brother Josh. We already know that he had a very close relationship with Ehud Barak, but he also was close with his top aide, Yoni Karen, who was Israeli military intelligence, frequently stayed at Epstein's New York residence, And it appears that Epstein even covered their 2012 cancer treatments. The question that persists is why, and what would make Epstein even worth being tapped for intelligence work to begin with. In order to build a solid case that he was, like with any good crime case, we should establish motive and opportunity. If we step back and take a broad look at just his story so far, many things begin to pop out as anomalous. By the early 80s, Epstein had already made a highly unusual transition that seemed to place him perfectly into a position that we can safely say would be extremely useful if, for example, you were an intelligence agency needing to move money through a bank that served as more of a CIA front than anything, and you needed to run them through another company to clear those trades. Having someone on the inside of that firm would be most useful, and let's recall he had gone from an unqualified teacher with no credentials to a position at Bear Stearns, one of the most prominent investment banks on Wall Street at that time. And he also did all that with no formal credentials in finance either. Superficially, and with no other qualifiers, we can say that he was already getting extremely lucky to say the least. From there, he moved up and into private wealth management, operating in a space that is, by design, opaque, handling money for ultra-high-end, high-net-worth individuals, often through complex and discrete financial structures. In a short time, Epstein cultivated relationships that seemed to just fall into his lap with influential figures across intelligence work, arms dealing, business, politics, and international circles, building him a network that spanned multiple countries and industries. This made him an international financier with strong connections to global elites, many with ties that could have afforded him opportunities to gather compromising info on them. Just based on these facts alone, Epstein was precisely the type of person that intel agencies seek out and frequently turn to. Individually, none of those elements are illegal on the surface, or can be seen as a smoking gun, showing that he worked for intel services. But taken together, they definitely place Epstein in a very specific and very rare position. He had access to enormous amounts of capital, proximity to very powerful individuals and groups, many with direct ties to intelligence, and the ability to somehow move between jurisdictions and social circles with ease. This combo of financial access, elite proximity, and international mobility isn't exactly common. And in the intel world, it has long proven to be very valuable. In intel work and covert operations, people who can operate across these boundaries often serve specific functions, acting as intermediaries, facilitators, fixers, or just access points to otherwise difficult to reach targets. Historically speaking, financial institutions, private wealth managers, and international social networks have all been used, at times, as environments where influence can be cultivated and information can be gathered. This, of course, does not make every financier an intelligence asset, but rarely do so many qualities align, and it does, at the very least, establish a pattern of how such roles can and have been utilized. Now, let's look at motive a bit deeper. If we step back once more and look at this structurally, a potential motive begins to stand out. If one person had direct access to powerful and influential people, the ability to build trust within elite circles, and control over environments that were private, unregulated, and socially insulated, that person, in theory, could be in a position to gather leverage, whether financial, personal, or reputationally. In spook terms, this is often called compromat, or compromising material that can be used to influence or control. Beyond all that, opportunity abounded. He didn't simply have access to elites. He created an environment around them. Private residences, exclusive gatherings, and highly controlled social spaces that would encourage people to lower their guard and their inhibitions, to nudge them towards their darkest and most base desires, all beyond the view of the public, but never out of sight of his many hidden cameras and surveillance systems. So the question isn't simply whether Epstein was working for intelligence agencies. A more grounded and easily provable question is, did he occupy a position that could have been highly useful to them? Because that is an easy question to answer with what we know to be facts. Yes, he absolutely did. And if we can reasonably assume that there was at least a solid case for saying that he was, or even could, then what happened next becomes a lot more difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence, or just more of his ridiculous luck. And systems don't build themselves around individuals like this by accident. So before we examine the evidence, investigation, and first arrest, it's important to understand the timeline that led up to it. Because once you lay out all of the progress of events from the late 80s through the early 2000s, a question that has haunted many investigators, including myself, for many years begins to emerge. How exactly did an individual operating in plain sight, who should have long been on the radar of financial and criminal regulatory bodies, over the course of decades, avoid meaningful interruption even as his network, net worth, and access continued to expand exponentially? That's what we're going to try to answer. Chapter 5. In Plain Sight. In the late 80s and early 90s, Epstein was transitioning out of his early roles in finance and into something far more specialized. Wrapping up the decade of excess, he was working with Stephen Hoffenberg, developing a strategy to perfect corporate rating in order to take over vulnerable corporations. Hoffenberg was a New York-based financier and businessman who became known in the late 80s for running Towers Financial Corp., one of the early examples of a blood-sucking debt collection and corporate finance firm. His specialties were debt acquisition, corporate restructuring, and on the surface at least, turnarounds of distressed companies. The two would meet through overlapping business and social networks within the elite realm of New York finance circles. Hoffenberg would bring Epstein in as an advisor, but his role would quickly expand beyond advisory and into operational and strategic involvement. Around 87 to 88, Epstein was working closely with Hoffenberg and had become a key consultant on financial strategy and was involved in structuring deals and serving in a role that blurred the line between employee, advisor, and independent operator. Their main work, however, revolved around aggressive acquisition strategies, or in less financial market gobbledygook, it was just good old corporate rating. Target distressed, failing, or just undervalued companies, acquire controlling interest in them, and then restructure or just strip them of all of their assets, then leveraging debt instruments tied to those companies. Towers Financial would overall specialize in purchasing delinquent debt portfolios and using those assets as a base to entice investors and lenders, while projecting an image of a sophisticated financial firm engaged in high-level corporate finance. Epstein was brought in 87, and from 88 to 93, Towers Financial raised over $400 million by selling bonds and promissory notes to investors, luring them in using falsified financial statements. They then took that money and used it to pay operating costs, repay some early investors, and above all, to pay themselves and afford them lavish lifestyles. That is, until February of 1993, when the SEC investigated the company and found that while they had fraudulently reported a $13 million profit between 87 and June of 1991, they had actually lost $137 million. By March of 1993, Towers Financial would have to file for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11. In April of 95, Hoffenberg would be forced to plead guilty to 5 criminal charges, which led to cheating thousands of investors out of $462 million in 1990s dollars. He would be sentenced to 20 years in prison at his 1997 trial and would end up serving 18 years. And while Hoffenberg was left holding the bag on the largest Ponzi scheme ever at that point, somehow Epstein would walk away scot-free for his part. Hoffenberg, however, has maintained that Epstein was the, quote, architect of the scam and deeply involved, which certainly seems to line up perfectly with when he was brought in and when the scam began. Hoffenberg also had incentive to shift blame, so it comes down to who you choose to believe. The SEC and FBI seem to zero in and center their investigation solely on Hoffenberg, despite ample evidence of Epstein's direct role. Document EFTA 0138677 shows an August 20th of 2018 court filing that lays out that role and explains how Epstein diverted the funds and funneled a substantial amount of the proceeds of the sale of Towers Financial Corporation, or TFC, bonds in order to pay TFC's operating costs. And to cover up the fraud, defendant Epstein directed collateral to be moved from one THRFC bond fund to another and falsified collateral records in the periodic reports to investors and SEC filings. Furthermore, Epstein and Hoffenberg created phony receivables, then included those items in reports designed to misrepresent the true financial picture of the THRFC bond funds. Despite defendant Epstein's central role in this now widespread massive Ponzi scheme, his actions were taken on behalf of TFC Hoffenberg's company, for which Epstein only consulted on. What enabled this, however, was a complete lack of prosecutorial pursuit of Epstein. By this time, he had already begun cultivating connections with high-level financial and legal figures. But officially, there is no clear public record explaining why he was not even pursued in this case. However you look at it, what it definitely shows is the first clear instance of him being embedded within a system that later collapses around someone else. As we previously touched on in part 1, a major turning point in his career came right about this same time, when in 1987 he founded a firm called J. Epstein & Company and took on Leslie Wexner as his seemingly only client. They would be introduced by Robert Meister, frequently downplayed as just an insurance executive who was the vice chairman of Aon Group, a professional services firm that specialized in providing risk management, insurance and reinsurance brokerage, and human resources consulting. His story is that he just happened to sit next to Epstein on a flight to Palm Beach and introduced him to his friend Les Wexner later on, even though Meister thought, according to his June 2021 Vanity Fair interview, that Epstein was, quote, a great bullshit artist. He would go on to say he actually warned Wexner to stay away from him, quote, hundreds of times, a claim Wexner denied in his 2026 deposition. For someone claiming to be so untrusting of Epstein, I also find it odd that he allowed his son, Todd Meister, to become very involved with Epstein's business. Robert would even have a mentor-type relationship, where he referred to himself as his, quote, mentor and friend in emails. Todd would become highly active in Epstein's life and maintained an active business and social relationship with Epstein long after his 2008 conviction. He would frequently forward business deals Epstein's way and frequently appeared on contact lists next to names like Leon Black, Michael Bloomberg, and other significant financial figures. Les Wexner would also seed Meister's, Todd's to be clear, hedge fund Pride Rock Management with millions, further showing the ties between Wexner, Meister, and Epstein. Robert appeared in Epstein's black book with 10 phone numbers and 3 addresses, and Todd had 10 numbers also and 2 addresses. Todd and Epstein also worked together on, quote, offshore reinsurance business of some sort, but exact details are missing from the files. Todd is also supposed to have introduced Epstein to wealthy and powerful people like Eric Schmidt, Steve Tisch, and allegedly even Ehud Barak, but I personally question that one. Regardless, Robert appears in 401 documents and Todd is in 973, so it is fairly safe to say that despite their claims to the contrary, the evidence shows that the Meister family was closely connected to Epstein. Back to our timeline though. In 96, Epstein would rename J. Epstein & Co. to Financial Trust Company and relocate it to St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He would explicitly advertise that he only managed assets for clients worth $1 billion or more, and he apparently specialized in, quote, wealth management, tax advice, estate planning, and accounting for ultra-wealthy. According to House Oversight Document 022058 in particular, Epstein, quote, spent most of his time coming up with creative new ways for the rich to avoid paying taxes, and that he, quote, charged flat fees for tax avoidance deals that generated enormous commissions. In general, from 1989 to his arrest in 2008, based solely on the documents and what the government would like you to believe, Epstein was just a private money manager for the world's richest people, while creating complex offshore tax structures and investment vehicles for ultra-wealthy clients. And it was this work and this work alone that funded his lavish lifestyle and built his fortune. This is the version that exists on paper, but only if you ignore all of the suspicious emails regarding references to abuse in young girls. Not to mention, there is no transparent list of these supposed wealthy clients whose money he was supposedly supposed to be managing. No traceable track record of large-scale deals or where the money was truly coming from. Yet he gains massive properties, a private jet, has a growing global footprint, and while Wexner certainly provided some of those things, it doesn't come close to accounting for all of it, nor does it explain his patterns of high-level access to major political figures, presidents, and global leaders, high-level academics, business elites, princes, queens, and more. Why would some private money manager, whom so many consider to be a con man, be connected to this level of cross-domain access? Well, in my opinion, I feel that it has a lot more to do with what else he was doing during this time period. 2002 is when documents appear showing organized recruitment and sex trafficking, but his history of abuse goes back much further. In the late 80s, he wasn't simply employed by Wexner, still moving in unknown intelligence circles, or pulling massive Ponzi schemes. No. He was getting connected with a major piece of shit named Jean-Luc Brunel through Ghislaine Maxwell. Documents confirm that Epstein funded Brunel's modeling agencies, which weren't just used as a recruitment strategy for finding new victims to be trafficked, but also as a legit appearing gateway for trafficking victims internationally. Brunel took a, quote, ownership stake in NEXT modeling agency in '88. Several former employees have stated that Epstein had an office there and was frequently seen around the office and taking meetings. You know who else was involved with NEXT? Erica Kirk, who strangely enough seems to magically end up in some way adjacent to pedophilia or human trafficking or both, which it becomes kind of strange when so many of those cases seem to be directly connected to something that she's connected with or to her. I'm not saying she's involved, but it's kind of odd. I don't know anybody that would be in any way remotely adjacent or connected to any of these kind of things, but she seems to end up connected to a lot of them. But of course, she is definitely a subject that deserves a whole other thing. There's plenty of other creators that have covered her ad nauseum though, so if you want that, it's out there. But getting back to the story, that pair would expand their victim pipeline in '05 when Epstein wired Brunel somewhere in the $1 million range to help launch the newly reformed U.S. division of Karen Models into MC2 Model Management, opening offices in New York and Miami. They would take on girls from 13 up to 21, I've seen some that said 27, I'm not really sure, and held scouting competitions for quote-unquote young teens. Court filings state that Epstein, Maxwell, Brunel, and others, quote, deliberately engaged in a pattern of racketeering that involved luring minor children through MC2, mostly girls under 17, to engage in sexual play for money, end quote, which feels a bit neutered for what they were actually doing. After Epstein's '08 conviction, Brunel visited him in jail at least 70 times that we know of during that 13-month sentence where he was laid up in his posh little quote-unquote imprisonment. Virginia Giuffre was the first one to actually allege Brunel's involvement in the trafficking scheme in a 2014 court filing where she laid out how Brunel would offer modeling jobs to girls as a cover for sex trafficking. She would also allege that she was trafficked to Brunel while she was underage in the early 2000s. And Virginia Giuffre, who was a very outspoken and out front, one of the few victims that decided to actually speak out and take some legal challenges to these people. And she was also the most recent of those people to mysteriously die, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the fourth part of this. Brunel also housed models in Epstein's condos at 301 East 66th Street, New York. Brunel appears on flight manifests for the Lolita Express at least 25 times from '98 to '05. In 2015, Brunel would turn around and sue Epstein, claiming that MC2 lost millions due basically because Epstein got caught. The lawsuit would be settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, surprise, surprise. In 2016, Brunel was secretly in contact with lawyers representing Epstein's victims. His lawyers reportedly stated that Brunel had recruited girls for Epstein and that he possessed incriminating photos. They would discuss a date for Brunel to walk into the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York in exchange for immunity as well. A federal prosecutor would write down, quote, one of Epstein's BFs, Jean-Luc Brunel, has helped get girls. He is wanting to cooperate, end quote, on a handwritten note in February of 2016, adding, quote, Brunel is afraid of being prosecuted. Epstein somehow got word that Brunel was negotiating to testify, though, and on May 3rd, he would send an email to Kathy Rumler, one of the attorneys that he was emailing with very frequently, who was also a former White House counsel for President Obama. to tell her Brunel was planning to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office that following week, and one of Brunel's acquaintances had, quote, asked for $3 million so that Jean-Luc would not go in. Epstein would tell Rumler that Brunel was afraid that he would be arrested if he didn't show up and said, quote, I want to know more. He also would dismiss Brunel's lawyer and acquaintance as, quote, scammers and said that he doubted their credibility. Rumler would write back a few hours later asking him to call and explain the whole thing. The following day, she would speak with Gregory Poe, Epstein's D.C. lawyer. While it isn't clear what exactly happened from here, what is clear is that Brunel would go dark after this and never respond to the attorneys or federal prosecutors when they tried to reach him. But despite not cooperating, he wouldn't be arrested and prosecutors didn't pursue him any further, which helped to leave Epstein free for another 3 years. According to David Boies, he was one of the attorneys that was working on behalf of the victims. This, quote, set us back a couple of years, and, quote, we know from our lawsuits that there was more than 50 girls that were trafficked after this. After Epstein's arrest on July 6 of 2019, Brunel vanished. He was last seen in public the day before at a Paris country club party. After Epstein's death, the Paris prosecutor's office would finally open an investigation into rape and sexual assault of minors, as well as criminal conspiracy connected to Epstein's case. Much like Epstein, police would eventually track down Brunel at an airport in Paris as he was about to board a flight to Senegal. He would be indicted on charges of drugging and raping several women in Paris, one of his signature slimeball moves that he used. Le Monde would report that 11 women had accused Brunel of sexual assault. Also, in an eerily similar fashion to Epstein, on February 19th of 2022, 75-year-old Brunel was allegedly found hanging in his cell at La Santé prison. An inquiry that was opened into his extremely timely death would conclude in March 2023 that he, unsurprisingly, died by suicide. And naturally, like so many others, his death occurred just before he was scheduled to stand trial, and, of course, all of the charges were dropped and no further investigating would take place. From all the way back into around 1994 through his final arrest, Epstein had documented victims. 2002 is just when the main trafficking network would officially land on documents. On one side, we have a financial operative moving in secrecy. On the other, we have a long documented history of continued and prolific abuse and trafficking. What is less clear is how in the hell those two realities coexisted and moved among so many elite names, unchallenged completely, for over a decade. Because during that same period, Epstein was accumulating vast and largely unexplainable wealth, building a network that spanned finance, politics, spies, and international royalty, operating with a level of excess that is extremely difficult to explain through conventional financial activity alone. Chapter 6. Locations and the first card falls. For decades, Jeffrey Epstein operated within a system that afforded him unparalleled privacy, access, and very little scrutiny. But in the early 2000s, cracks would begin to show. It didn't come from a large-scale investigation or an audit of his mysterious finances, but from a single victim report. At this point in time, Epstein was primarily operating out of his lavish Palm Beach estate and his property that was off the coast of St. Thomas, Little St. James, Little Pedophile Island. How he actually acquired what would soon come to be known as Epstein Island isn't exactly clear either. Shocker, I know. From what I was able to trace back, though, property records seem to show that on April 27th of 1998, Epstein would use a shell company called LSJ LLC in Little St. James LLC, super creative, I know, which he used to conceal his purchase of the property from its previous owner, a pretty sketchy venture capitalist guy, Archibald Arch Cumming, who Epstein was connected with since the 90s. It was listed for sale by old Golden Arch in 97 for $10.5 million. Epstein would make the acquisition in 98 for just $7.95 million. In 2011, Epstein would transfer ownership into Nautilus Inc., with him remaining the beneficial owner through quote-unquote revocable trusts that do not affect title to the land. As for what Nautilus Inc. is in this context, your guess is really as good as mine. I found a Nautilus Inc. that was a fitness company. It was at one time the parent company to brands like Bowflex, Schwinn Fitness, and Stairmaster, which Epstein was never in any way affiliated with, so please don't take that to mean that. So it's pretty safe to assume that it was just another shell company that Epstein established in the Virgin Islands solely to disguise his ownership. Slightly lesser known is that Epstein also purchased the neighboring Great St. James Island using another shell company called Great St. James LLC. this guy, man. I hate him. And if it just comes through in some of this, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to give this the least amount of bias as I can. But I want to make it clear, I cannot stand this person. So it's a feat. It's a feat to accomplish. I'm doing my best here. Anyways, he would make the purchase for not quite the entire island, just 3 parcels of land totaling 80 acres initially in January of 2016 for $17.5 million from Bjorn Kier. I'm not even going to try and say that again. Whose real name is Christian Kjor, a Danish businessman and former attorney. He is also one of the wealthiest people in Denmark and a former friend of the Danish royal family. He actually refused to sell it to Epstein due to his '08 conviction, which, another reason why Epstein used the shell company to try and hide his identity. The company was initially registered in the name of Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because he is the same guy who sent Epstein the torture video that was prompting the April '09 email where Epstein writes, quote, "Where are you? Are you okay? I love the torture video." He would purchase the remaining parcels a short time later for $5 million, bringing the total to $22.5 million. Bear in mind, nothing at any point, anywhere explains where all of that money came from fully. In the early 2000s, though, Epstein had already established a pedo sanctuary on Little St. James that included renovations and expansions of the primary residence, as well as construction of the Gold Dome temple decked out in the colors of Israel. He also owned a property called Zorro Ranch, a sprawling mansion in the high desert of Santa Fe County, along the outskirts of the community of Stanley, New Mexico. And that's what you'll see in most contemporary reporting, is that it's on the outskirts of this little nothing town. Nothing really could be further from the truth. It is not on the outskirts of anything. It is completely isolated and surrounded by desert. There is nothing around this thing for miles and miles, which definitely contributed to the isolating, terrifying nature of the victims that were brought there, just for the record. Epstein would acquire this property on February 22nd of '93 from former New Mexico Governor Bruce King for approximately $12 million. Along with the primary estate, Epstein also assumed the King's family's 1,200 acres of state-owned land of leases that were designated for cattle grazing. Once again, this is a desert. There's not going to be any cattle grazing, but it's definitely a way to get around having to pay a lot more taxes. Or to have to buy a lot more land, because it just kind of was included thanks to the state. Once again, he would use a shell company, Zorro Trust. I bet you never guessed that one right. Which he would later rename Cypress Inc. After purchasing it, he would completely transform the former cattle ranch property into a lavish estate, building a 26,700 square foot mansion with a living room described as being the size of an average American home. Before we dive into any more about this property, I think it's important to ask who built this property. Well, the construction was handled by Bradbury Stam Construction, which, interestingly enough, also happens to be a government contractor that works on high-security nuclear facilities, which, might raise just, its own host of interesting questions. That's all I'm saying. He would also add a private airstrip with a hangar and a helipad that was designed specifically for discreet arrivals. He also built a firehouse, a 7-bay heated garage, and, quote, various buildings designed to look like a Western film set. I wish that I was joking, but alas, I am not. I also wish that I was joking about how Zorro Ranch was Epstein's ground zero and base of operations for his plan to spread his DNA across the human race. This was reported in the New York Times, who said that Epstein had privately told scientists and business associates that he hoped to use the ranch as a base where women would be inseminated with his sperm and would give birth to babies. Considering all we know and all we can reasonably suspect about Epstein, I do not want to know what he had planned for those babies. In document EFTA 01657839, you will find an email with the from and to fields fully redacted. The only name is in the end where it's simply signed as, quote, "Thank you, Conchita." It mentions, quote, "some interesting facts that should be passed on to the investigative agent on the Epstein case." I will copy Director Mueller. And I feel that it's important to at least say that it at least holds enough significant and actionable information The New Mexico state legislature and investigative bodies are now looking into it even further, finally. So I struggle to dismiss this as hearsay or in any way fraudulent or fake. It lists out 4 items. The first is that Zorro Trust won an $80 million lottery ticket in New Mexico. 2, the ranch that's close to the U.S.-Mexican border, where most trafficked children are routed before being dispersed to the East Coast. 3, several high-ranking officials and friends of Epstein have confirmed that he had sexual relations with trafficked minors. And 4, both Ghislaine Maxwell and a redacted name were served last week. 2 key witnesses from within Epstein's camp. Another email that referenced the ranch from within the files is EFTA 01250229. And this is the email that is actually causing the biggest stir and pushing regulatory and law enforcement bodies within New Mexico to dig much further into this now, finally. And it's from a redacted name and address, but it was sent to Eddie Oregon, who is a conservative voice in talk show radio, and he's based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. He also owns KIVA, and was a one-time mayoral hopeful who plans to run against Gabe Vasquez, the incumbent congressman from New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District, in the upcoming primaries. The email claims to be a former member of staff at Zorro Ranch who took compromising videos from the ranch before they left as, quote, insurance in case of future litigation against Epstein. The 3rd paragraph contains this statement, quote, what is damning about Jeffrey Epstein is yet to be written. Did you know somewhere in the hills outside the Zorro, 2 foreign girls were buried on the orders of Jeffrey and Madam G. Both died by strangulation during rough fetish sex. Below that are truncated links to video files and 1 audio file, and they're all various links, titled 1, Sex Video with Minor, 2, Threesome Video, 3, Threesome Video, 4, Underage Girl Sex Video, 5, Underage Girl Matthew Mellon Video, 6, Underage Girl Rape Fantasy Video. Just real quick, this is Future Josh chiming in here. I wanted to help myself out with this one. Because that whole Matthew Mellon, his name stood out to me, but I was too consumed with getting these things together to actually look it up then. But, and I'm going from memory, so you guys bear with me. Basically, Matthew Mellon, I think it was like Matthew Mellon II, technically. But he was a business guy, New York Republican State Finance Committee member, son of the Mellon family, which is judges and a banker and some kind of somewhat old money in New York. He was basically just kind of a playboy. He ran around doing what he do, very social. I know that he had an investment in XRP at one point. I think he invested $2 million and flipped that into like $1 billion fortune. And he happened to die in April of 2018 in Cancun, Mexico. He was down there going to a recovery clinic trying to get clean because he had like a $100,000 a month Oxycontin addiction apparently. But he was found dead in the hotel room, and it was ruled as he had a heart attack, and saying that it was a result of taking ayahuasca. You can read into that what you will, but I had to at least dig into who Matthew Mellon was, so there you go. Back to Josh from the past, take it away. And 7, girl from Bay Area suicide attempt confession to Madam G audio. They then asked for 1 Bitcoin by 6 p.m. that day to the BTC wallet address, which the file is in the folder for this episode, but I'm not going to read it out on air. But I've been trying to pull ledger entries to narrow down the owner, or at least the location of that wallet, but I haven't had any luck yet. If anyone out there thinks that they can help on that, please hit me up at clandestinradiopodcast@proton.me. That's our secure tip email. They then state that a USB containing the files will be sent anonymously by overnight carrier upon receipt of funds. You have my assurance that this is exclusive, never shared before. No authorities, no samples, no questions, please. Confirm ASAP. Bear in mind, Frey, Shantae Davis, and others have claimed that they were trafficked to that ranch and abused by Epstein, Ghislaine, and several other men whose names they will likely never release, at least not on their own. Zorro Ranch seems to be one of the darkest rabbit holes in the entire investigation, and that's saying a lot because there are some very dark rabbit holes. Its remote location, limited access, and secretive nature made it the perfect location for abuse, potential murder, and Epstein's proclaimed one-man eugenics mission to better mankind through seeding the human race with his DNA, using genetic engineering. In Part 3, we will dive even deeper into his more ambitious and far darker plans, such as his involvement with Bill Gates and pandemic preparedness and much, much more. But for now, since we have now that we have a decent sense of his properties down, let's jump back to our timeline and what took place leading up to his first arrest. Up to this point, Epstein had been operating unencumbered for well over a decade, as far as his trafficking and abuse networks were concerned. He hadn't had to face any real meaningful pressure or even public scrutiny, despite the vast nature of his operations. All of that, however, was about to change. The initial suspicion actually started with Ghislaine on December 6 of 2001. One of the few documents that have actually been released from 2001 within the Epstein files details a police report based on tips that Maxwell was recruiting young women from a nearby college to answer phones at Epstein's Palm Beach estate. The reports would go on to describe, quote, they were paid $200 per day for this service. It is unclear what is occurring in the residence, end quote. $200 is pretty crazy money for answering phones for a few hours, especially in 2001 money. So naturally, when some English lady is approaching random attractive college girls and offering $200 to come to her house and answer phones, it tends to raise some concerns, especially when she specifies that she wants, quote, young, beautiful, unmarried women. 3 of the girls described in the report described Maxwell and Epstein after working there as being, quote, secretive about what was going on in the house. The report goes on to say that one girl who went multiple times described the phone calls that they were answering as being, quote, men calling saying when they were going to drop off particular girls, which would seem to indicate that his operations was much more extensive than what the DOJ seems willing to admit and involved many more perpetrators than just Epstein and Maxwell. 2 of the girls in the report, at least, quote, complained about Epstein touching them inappropriately. They also told police that Maxwell had asked for a list of other girls who could work on short notice and explained that she needed a, quote, large pool of girls because she didn't know how many she would need at any given time. After these reports, police would note that they had difficulty reaching them again for follow-up, but didn't elaborate on what they meant. Worth possibly noting is the fact that while an accurate total isn't publicly available, according to the official Florida Missing Persons Clearinghouse and secondary reporting, Palm Beach County was a major missing teens hotspot from the late 90s through mid-2000s, precisely when Epstein's trafficking activities seemed to have been at their peak. Palm Beach and Palm Beach County were frequently listed as a central part of the overall missing teens, particularly female teens, picture in Florida during those years. While a strong and I feel compelling correlation, especially considering the other context that we have, I can't say with any certainty, of course, or allege any direct causation. I do, however, find it an interesting and noteworthy piece of the larger picture. And while these reports do not, on their own, establish a full scope of what was occurring, they do suggest that elements of a pattern were already likely in place years before any formal investigation became known. According to the police, they did attempt to investigate further. They went through Epstein's discarded trash, finding listings for massages in New York, list of females with ages, descriptions, and, quote, what they do, whatever that means. They don't appear to have elaborated on that. They also apparently researched phone and business records for Epstein and Maxwell and tracked down other students who said that they too were approached by Maxwell and stated there was something, quote, weird about the two, but stopped short of saying that they had witnessed anything outright illegal at that point. In another student interview, it was revealed that there were women running around the pool area topless and that people were always getting massages. The final entry of the 4-page report is dated April 25, 2002 and simply reads, quote, although it appears as though usual, which I believe was a typo given the rest of this, activity is occurring at this residence, at this time no illegal activity has been reported or detected. After this, it appears that no further investigation took place, and Epstein and Maxwell were allowed to continue the trafficking and abuse activities for another 3 years without having to worry about pressure from the authorities. Then, roughly 3 years later, something would happen that would finally threaten to expose the pair, and at long last bring down the entire house of cards onto their heads, and it all started with a single phone call. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Reckoning. On March 14, 2005, the Palm Beach police would receive a call from a woman who didn't wish to identify herself at this time, but would later be ID'd, though, as being the stepmother. And she stated that her 14-year-old stepdaughter may have been molested by, quote, a wealthy man, and that she had learned about this from the mother of her stepdaughter's friend who called her after overhearing a conversation between her daughter and a male friend who discussed how her stepdaughter had, quote, met with a 45-year-old man and had sex with him and was paid for it, end quote. The stepmother said that she wasn't sure what to do and wouldn't meet with police until she spoke with her husband and her stepdaughter's mother. Later that day, she would call back along with the father and told police that they had spoken with the mother and they agreed to bring the 14-year-old victim to meet with police. The couple would come to the police department, but the girl refused to speak to them about it and wouldn't admit that it had happened. I'm including all of those details, not only to lay out the facts of the story, but to also try to illustrate that it was only by dumb luck that anyone ever found out and then took action. It illustrates how difficult it is for victims to speak out in those sort of cases, the fear and the shame that usually goes along with all the other effects and keeps untold numbers of sexually abused children silent. For all of the known victims who spoke out about his abuse, there were likely hundreds, maybe even thousands, given how prolific he was and how long he was allowed to operate, who just stayed silent, but were still damaged, many for life, from what this man and his associates did. And this is only one note. That's what I want you to remember with this entire series. This is only one single network. And that is why stories like this, like Franklin, Mark Dutroux, The Finders, Casapia, and Cora, and on and on and on and on, are so damn important to investigate and expose. So many times the victims couldn't speak, or they weren't believed, and no one was there to give them a voice. So many times the sick bastards who perpetrated, facilitated, or organized that abuse just got to walk away and live their lives while maybe one or two fall guys end up ever taking the rap for this stuff. And the real story is always swept under the rug, lied about, or just forgotten about. This isn't a side effect, and it's not an oversight, and it isn't a few mistakes or mishandlings. It is the fucking system. Anyway, eventually the story of what happened came out, and it detailed this 14-year-old girl who was recruited by, quote, an older girl and brought to Epstein, who paid her $300. Which again, back in 2001, that bought a lot more than it does today. In order to strip down and massage Epstein. This was his game. This is how he and his sick friends would get close to these girls initially. Then, once they would be pushed to do more and more sexual acts for the money. These are children, mind you. And they targeted ones from low-income backgrounds specifically, which would need the money and would see it as the only way to make that sort of money at that age. They are separated from their only support in a luxury that they could only imagine before this. Many likely very scared of not doing what they were told and unsure of how they would even get back home if they didn't, which is why Epstein chose progressively more isolated locations for his homes. It wasn't just to avoid oversight or be away from prying eyes. His wealth and his connections shielded him from that pretty well already. I believe it was to further isolate his victims and to increase the depravity of what he felt was possible in these locations. Back to this report, though. She alleges that she was paid and undressed but left wearing her underwear. To their credit, following these allegations, the Palm Beach PD would launch a more intensive 13-month investigation that did include a search of his residence, which I have on very good authority that he was tipped off prior to that search happening. But throughout the course of this investigation, Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Ryder, who is the only, one of the very few at least, members of authority that actually tried to do the right thing, it seems, on multiple occasions throughout this. But he would publicly accuse the Palm Beach County State Prosecutor, Barry Kreischer, who I've spoken about at some length on here before whenever I did the last of the Franklin series, of being too lenient on Epstein's case, and he called for help from the FBI. At that point, the FBI would join the investigation. From here, the allegations would grow massively. They would interview 5 of the victims and 17 witnesses under oath. Evidence recovered from Epstein's trash would show that many of the girls involved were under 18. The youngest recorded by Epstein was 14. The majority were under 16. The subsequent search of Epstein's property uncovered some hidden cameras and a large number of photos of girls throughout the house. Some of them were ones that were previously interviewed by police and had made allegations of sexual assault, but suspiciously missing were a whole lot of hard drives, which we'll touch on here in a minute. The police records show that a former Polish model named Adriana Ross, who we'll also talk about in the next part, who worked for Epstein as an assistant, had reportedly removed computer drives and other electronic equipment from the home before the police arrived to search it, which could potentially indicate a leak from either inside the department or from, as I personally suspect, within the state prosecutor's office, or even the FBI. They also found several books on slavecraft and training women for sexual slavery, which can we please also investigate the sick bastards that are writing these books to begin with? A former Epstein employee would tell police that Epstein would receive massages 3 times a day. I'm sure it was just to relieve all of that tension that builds up from a life of stealing money, raping kids, and running blackmail ops. Poor guy was probably just all knotted up from such hard work. But I digress. Eventually, throughout the process of the joint investigation, the FBI would compile statements of, quote, 34 confirmed minors that were eligible for restitution, a number that would go up to 40 in the MPA, whose allegations of sexual abuse also included corroborating evidence. Years later, in a 2018 expose for the Miami Herald, journalist Julie Brown would identify at least 80 victims and was able to locate about 60 of them. In that same piece, she would quote Police Chief Ryder as saying, quote, "This was 50-something she's and 1 he, and that the she's all basically told the same story." Further details in the case include allegations stating that, quote, 12-year-old triplets were flown in from France for Epstein's birthday and then flown back the following day after being abused by the financier. It was alleged that young girls were recruited from Brazil and other South American countries, former Soviet countries, and Europe, and that Jean-Luc Brunel's MC2 modeling agency was also supplying girls to Epstein. Still, once it came down to levying charges, Palm Beach police would only file a probable cause affidavit stating Epstein should be charged with 4 counts of unlawful sex with minors and 1 count of sexual abuse. It wouldn't be until July 27th of 2016 that Palm Beach PD would finally get the go-ahead to arrest Epstein, and it was only on 2 charges: 1 felony count of procuring a minor for prostitution and solicitation of a prostitute for abusing young girls, raping literal children. By the way, if Spotify doesn't like me saying the truth, I will go put this entire series up for free on the Patreon page. I care way more about speaking the truth at this point and all of what was done than I care any little bit about having this up on Spotify or other platforms that don't pay me anything anyway. So, if I'm going to do this for free, I'm going to get it right. Epstein would be booked into Palm Beach County Jail and then released the following day on a $3,000 bond. Cannabis arrests get way higher bonds most of the time, for the record. And that's for first-time arrests with no criminal history whatsoever, at least where I live. This guy could literally wipe his ass with $250,000 and set it on fire without a care, and he gets $3,000 bond for what he did to children. It's the system, folks. I hate to tell you. This would be when, as discussed in Part 3 of the Franklin series, that frequent ADL award-winning, APAC-supporting state prosecutor Kreischer would convene a Palm Beach County grand jury. The full transcript of that joke of a grand jury is in the research folder, which I'll drop a link for in the Discord at the end of all this. But what becomes very obvious from the start of that, state prosecutor Miss Belolovec, rather than trying to do her job and build the case against Epstein, is working much more on the side of the defense during her examination of Detective Ricari and the victims. Rather than fact-finding or building the case, she immediately begins poking holes in her own prosecution case. During her examination of the 14-year-old, who was now 16 at this time of the grand jury, she spends the majority of the time digging into her MySpace page and trying to paint her as a drug-abusing party animal and a whore who lies. Using the answers from a survey that she did on her previous account about kind of have-you-ever style questions, she would go one by one through all of the potentially incriminating answers, or any that would paint the victim in a bad light, never even once bothering to make what should have been another obvious connection that puts all of those things into perspective, that troubled teens are frequently targeted for that very reason. They're easier for juries to be turned on and for defense attorneys to make out as being addicts and liars. But they're not things that you will see in a typical prosecution's approach so often, and definitely not to the point that Belolovec does on Kreischer's orders. Even during a point where she actually opened the floor to jurors to ask the victim questions, she took it upon herself to ask, quote, "You are aware that you committed a crime." This was after a juror asked if she was aware of what she was doing to her reputation. Last I checked, the one on trial here was supposed to be Jeffrey Epstein, not some kid who was taken advantage of and victimized. I'm doing my best here to present this information as factually and objectively as possible wherever I can, but this entire case is and should be infuriating to any decent human being with any whiff of a soul left. And this complete farce of a grand jury hearing is a perfect example of how Epstein's wealth and connections, and likely, in my opinion, blackmail in many circumstances, insulated and protected him and facilitated the victim-blaming approach that was later perfected by the DOJ, which is what allowed him to continue abusing underage girls for years after this. It also shows, as Franklin illustrated so well, how victims are shamed or threatened into silence, blamed for the crimes that are done to them, and the chilling effect that it has on others being willing to actually talk, who are now afraid that they'll just be done the same way or even worse. That element of all of this is a very significant part of how people like Epstein, King, and many others, particularly those who are wealthy and move in so-called elite circles, are allowed to operate for so long unimpeded. Well, that and the services they provide to other people like that. The corrupt nature of the system itself and how easily it can be manipulated and conscripted to serve the wrong side by those with wealth, power, and influence is disgusting. Back to the grand jury. Belolovec would bring the detective back onto the stand, and while getting the details of the investigation, would take every single little chance that she could to discredit or poke minor holes into the case. From all the years that I've been doing journalism and all of the probably millions of court pages of documents and transcripts that I've had to read over, I've never seen a prosecutor work so hard to undermine their own case as what Belolovec displays before this grand jury. The one highlight of the 176-page transcript was learning of Epstein's, quote, deformed penis. The grand jury transcript overall, however, is extremely enraging. If I went through all of this, it would be an even longer series, and most of you would probably tune out anyway. It will be provided for anyone who wants to dig a little bit deeper, though. In summary, Belolovec primarily seems to take every available opportunity to paint as many of the victims as she could as being willing prostitutes with poor moral character. There were a few questionable redactions, like censoring the word high from high school, or any combination of words that would disclose his preferred hunting ground was a local high school. During juror questioning of the detective Riccari, he would disclose that their investigation was limited in some regards because, quote, too much information was being leaked back to him. And during open juror questioning, Belolovec would chime in frequently to cast doubts where possible and to control the nature of questions, and frequently cut jurors off or try to stop further questions from being asked. Primarily, what I learned from that little set of documents there was that at this time, Epstein had two other quote-unquote assistants that were part of this aside from Ghislaine. That would be Nadia Marcinkova, who we'll get into in part 3, but she was born in Slovakia in '86 and then brought to the U.S. to be, according to testimony, Epstein's sex slave. She was groomed and abused, and then by this time was an active participant. The other was Sarah Kellen, who was Epstein's primary personal scheduler and assistant. Kellen appears on at least 364 documented flights on his aircrafts, a number only that is eclipsed by Maxwell herself. On May 1st of 2006, Detective Joe Riccari swore a probable cause affidavit recommending charges against Kellen as, quote, principal in the first degree for unlawful sexual activity with a minor in lewd and lascivious molestation. She was a primary component in Epstein's sexual abuse and trafficking ring. Nadia and Kellen, alongside two others that served similar roles, Leslie Groff and Adriana Ross, would never actually be charged, however, due to the immunity that they received as part of Epstein's September 24, 2007 non-prosecution agreement, which is ultimately what all of this grand jury grandstanding actually led to. Chapter 8, A Deal with the Devil. By the time of Epstein's first arrest, he had multiple women assisting in feeding his darkest desires, and a group of girls under them that functioned as essentially a pyramid scheme for abuse. Girls who came in would be encouraged to recruit young girls to bring to him, and would be paid the same typical $200 to $300 each time they brought one, which is the same thing that the new victim would receive. Despite the fact that Palm Beach Police Department felt they had evidence to charge Epstein on 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation and 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor, State Attorney Kreischer chose to make a very unusual move and send it instead to a grand jury to decide what to charge Epstein with. And just to recap, his assistant prosecutor Belolovec would then proceed to completely and very obviously tank the case before the jury, taking precise steps to discredit her own witnesses in the case multiple times, to paint them as druggies and prostitutes, even calling another Palm Beach Police Department officer on the stand for no other reason than to grill him about charges that the 14-year-old victim had previously received that were drug-related, and again insinuate that she was a whore for hanging around guys who were drinking while underage. And those drugs were weed, for the record. It was freaking weed. It wasn't like she was out here smoking crack. Just want to make that clear. This would all lead to the jury only indicting Epstein on the one lowest possible charge, 1 count of soliciting prostitution, which is what a John who gets caught with an adult prostitute would get, by the way. Despite the fact that investigators were able to identify at least 35 or 36 underage victims, possibly even more than 40. In subsequent investigations, including an in-depth expose by the Miami Herald, roughly 80 total victims were abused from that 2001 to 2006 period. Other estimates from various attorneys claimed Epstein may have abused over 100 girls during that time in Florida. And again, the prosecution ultimately put forth 1 solicitation charge in the end. Oh, and by the way, all the dirt that the prosecution had on these girls, it came from Alan Dershowitz, who met with them prior to the grand jury, which was delayed afterwards. In August of 2006, Epstein would enter a plea of not guilty to the single count of soliciting. 8 months later, the case still hadn't been brought to trial. All the while, Epstein was able to do as he pleased as a free man, and of course, allowed to continue his abuse and trafficking. The only progress was a February 20th, 2007 meeting between U.S. prosecutors and Epstein's defense team members, Dershowitz, Roy Black, and Gerald Lefcourt, on June 26, 2007. They would meet again. Bear in mind, no witnesses had been deposed, no trial date had been set, and according to all outer signs, it seemed as if the state really didn't want to bring the case at all. Finally, exactly 1 month later, on July 26, the U.S. Attorney's Office presented a state 2-year incarceration plea agreement. 5 days later, they would meet again and the defense would say that the jail time wasn't an option. Exactly 1 month later, on August 31st, they would present a case debriefing to the DOJ representative for further negotiations. And look, I know that some of this procedural stuff is incredibly boring, and I appreciate you listening through it, but this is all stuff that I didn't know anything about until I started going through these documents diligently. I'd seen virtually no reporting on how they actually got to the point of even doing the no prosecution deal. As for what became of the FBI's involvement, while all of this was going on, back in July, the FBI, at the behest of Chief Ryder, who, as you'll recall, felt that Kreischer was being too lenient and was, quote, in the tank for Epstein, would open his own investigation into Epstein, nicknamed Operation Leap Year. During the process of their investigation, they had built a case for serious federal sex trafficking charges. After speaking to 34 minors whose allegations all included corroborating details, and they also identified those additional victims that we spoke of, federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office who would go to work based on their information, and with the knowledge of U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, drafted a 53-page, 60-count indictment that was rock solid. Federal prosecutor Marie Villafana, who is another one of the rare good eggs in all of this, would also include an 82-page memo for her supervisors that laid out a draft federal indictment with counts related to enticement and trafficking of minors. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Acosta wasn't ready to go forward with it. Pivotal in that decision was the lead prosecutor, Matthew Minchell, who we will get to in a sec. And why, you might ask, why didn't the federal case move forward and end his entire racket right there in 07? Great question. And what we know is that prosecutors familiar with the federal draft indictment began reaching out to Epstein's lawyers, and his lawyers would end up meeting with the federal prosecutors, pushing them to end the Fed investigation in order for Epstein to only face the single Florida solicitation charge. Back to Matthew Minchell. Another of Epstein's lawyers was Lillian Sanchez, who represented Epstein's aviation entities JEGE Inc. and Hyperion Air Inc. throughout that entire 07 federal investigation, who also just so happened to have dated and remained close with Minchell, who failed to disclose that fact to superiors out of fear that he would be excused from the case over a conflict of interest, like he should have been. After Minchell left the federal prosecution's job, he and Epstein had several meetings, and emails show that he was wanting and willing to take on legal work for Epstein afterwards, despite strong objection from the lead federal prosecutor, Marie Villafana, who would later say that she had only helped finalize the plea deal under Acosta's direction, and that she actually pushed back really hard to move on the full 53-page federal indictment because she believed that they had sufficient evidence to prove the case in court. She would also later tell investigators that the U.S. Attorney's Office management gave, quote, undue weight to the defense team's claims that they would discredit the victims in court, calling the defense team's claims about the victims slanderous and unsupported. The defense team's claims would supposedly cause doubt internally among prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office that they could prove the case in court. So shook was Acosta, apparently, that not only did he not believe that they could win in court, but that if it was kicked back down to Florida, that they would, quote, let him walk free. So according to him, he chose to make a, quote, strategic choice to ensure that Epstein served actual jail time, rather than risking a loss at the trial. He claimed a federal trial, despite all of the victims, mind you, would have been a, quote, roll of the dice or a crapshoot. While a later DOJ report would criticize his quote-unquote poor judgment, it would also deny that Epstein's wealth or influence played any role, and they found no evidence of corruption. Gotta love when the government investigates the government. I'm sure it was totally above board though, so, there's that. So rather than actually try to take their case to trial, Acosta would decide to make Epstein a deal. That deal went like this. It began with a very abbreviated list of offenses. Number 1, of knowing and willingly conspiring with others, known and unknown, to use a facility or means of interstate or foreign commerce to knowingly pursue, induce, or entice minor females to engage in prostitution. 2, knowingly and willing conspiring with others known and unknown to travel in interstate commerce for the purpose of engaging in illicit sexual conduct with minor females. 3 is all of that but pursued, induced, or entice minor females to engage in prostitution. In other words, sex trafficking. 4, traveling in interstate commerce for the purpose of engaging in illicit sexual conduct with minor females. And 5, recruiting, enticing, and obtaining by means a person knowing that person had not attained the age of 18 years and would be caused to engage in a commercial sex act. The terms for Epstein were that he had to plead guilty to the federal solicitation charge, as well as to a, quote, information filed by the state attorney's office charging Epstein with an offense that requires him to register as a sex offender, which was the one added charge of solicitation of minors to engage in prostitution. Rather than just read out all the lawyer gobbledygook of the agreement, and it's all in that folder if you want to read it, I'll just lay out what he was actually ordered to do, what he really did, and why they don't actually align. The 2 charges that he had to plead to were what was core to the deal. He was ordered to serve 18 months total, 12 months and 6 months, with the main stipulation being that he had to be consecutively imprisoned without, quote, any opportunity for withholding, adjudication, or sentencing, and without probation or community control in lieu of the imprisonment. What actually took place, even despite that fact, and under the Florida rules, a convicted sex offender were generally ineligible for work release, was that almost immediately he was granted this privilege where he was able to quote-unquote work at a company that he started literally just before he was about to start his sentence, called the Florida Science Foundation. More on that in just a minute. Rather than being locked up in Gin Pop, Sheriff Rick Bradshaw would have Epstein in an entire private wing, which he claimed was for quote-unquote high-profile inmates needing protection. During his stay there, He was allowed to check out of his little private suite for up to 16 hours a day to quote-unquote work, which he went back and forth in a limo or a private car with a driver. Not only that, logs show that he was also allowed to go to his Palm Beach mansion at least 9 separate times during quote-unquote work hours, were assigned deputies that provided security outside of his home for hours at a time, despite his permit only allowing for him to travel to and from his office address. The only parts of the deal that Epstein really honored in any capacity was his forced registration as a sex offender and victim restitution, though that was extremely limited by the deal itself, and none of those victims were ever consulted or even told about the deal before it was offered or signed, which should have been procedure in that kind of a situation. How did Epstein not only get such a sweetheart deal, but also manage to even further subvert its already far too lax terms? Well, there isn't really one singular explanation for that. Definitely not that would ever be investigated or spoken of anywhere, if there was. What we can use to reasonably infer, though, is that at least a good portion of that reason is as follows. Records show that on December 14, 2004, roughly 3 months before the formal investigation began, Epstein donated $90,000 to the Palm Beach Police Department for, quote, purchase of a firearms simulator, though according to police it was returned following his arrest. Though he would also make a $40,000 donation that doesn't seem to be refuted and ever returned after his arrest between 2008 and 2009, he paid the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department, where he was part-time incarcerated, over $128,000, which the department says was for his work release, and went towards paying off-duty deputies to guard him during his quote-unquote workday. Speaking of, what exactly did this supposed work at his newly formed Florida Science Foundation consist of? Well, aside from the fact that it was a non-profit established solely for the purpose of fulfilling his supposed work release, the job was entirely fabricated. What he did in reality, which is supported by court documents and an in-depth investigation by the Miami Herald, was, quote, primarily to continue sex trafficking and improper sexual conduct rather than legitimate work, in which he spent 12 to 16 hours per day in a West Palm Beach office where he brought young women, had sex, and managed finances, all under the not-so-watchful eye of his paid security. Victim lawsuits would allege Epstein used his office to do all of this while under the paid supervision of Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies. Records show that while on work release, Epstein was able to transfer millions of dollars in cash around. And of course, the bought and paid for security provided by the sheriff deputies enabled this continued behavior, not only at a supposed office, but he was allowed to have sex in a vehicle on the property and elsewhere. He was also allowed significant freedom both at work and at the jail, including seemingly unlimited personal visits, quote-unquote medical trips to see a chiropractor as much as 3 times a week, and more. Documents show how Epstein attempted and was often successful in influencing and even completely subverting nearly every level of the criminal justice system that threatened him, which allowed, and at times even knowingly facilitated, as stated, his sex trafficking and money laundering empire, and allowed him to continue to sexually abuse minors and adult women virtually unimpeded for decades. And if you take the time to actually extract the information, the Epstein files illustrate across hundreds of documents and emails just how effective he was at influencing over to his side everyone from federal and state prosecutors, assistant district attorneys, sheriffs, deputies, probation officers, federal marshals, and even all the way down to Customs and Border Patrol officers. But let's name names. Something that we'll be doing more and more in the remainder of this episode and series, come what may. The records show that he, at bare minimum, tried to develop relationships from a wide range of current and former prosecutors, including Alex Acosta, Jeff Sloman, Acosta's former deputy for South Florida, U.S. Attorney's Office Matthew Minchell, the former chief criminal prosecutor that we spoke of earlier, Bruce Reinhart, a former South Florida federal prosecutor, Barry Kreischer, the state attorney who made the virtually unprecedented decision to let a grand jury decide what to prosecute Epstein on, Michael Gager, who was the chief deputy of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office when he was in prison there. Well, kind of, and even his court-appointed sex addiction doctor, Stephen Alexander, who he would use to pass back-channel messages back and forth to government and law enforcement officials that he was seeking to secretly gain favor with. Epstein, along with his lawyers, did all that they could to remove his New York sex offender status by coaching the assistant district attorney working under then Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance, using political loyalists who he donated to and had relationships with, along with his sex addiction doctor, to reduce his Florida requirements as well, by using them to appeal to former Governor Charlie Crist. And it wasn't as if the DOJ was unaware of those reported attempts to undermine and compromise the legal system. Multiple internal documents show that at least 2 federal probes were launched into his attempts. One was in 2011 that looked into whether or not Epstein unduly influenced federal prosecutors during his Florida case, and after his death another would be launched in 2020 that examined allegations that U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers were persuaded to turn a blind eye to the various young female passengers that Epstein flew into St. Thomas, all aboard his Lolita Express, before bringing them over to his island. I'm sure you'll be shocked to know that neither of these probes resulted in criminal charges. Then, following the scathing investigation piece by the Miami Herald, the DOJ's own Office of Professional Responsibility, or OPR, would open yet another investigation at the urging of Congress to investigate possible improprieties surrounding the Florida prosecutors. Yet, even despite clear evidence that at least one of them, Reinhardt, had literally started to lay the groundwork to begin working for Epstein, the OPR would ultimately conclude that there was no evidence of prosecutorial misconduct from any of the South Florida prosecutors. Reinhardt would issue a sworn statement denying that he was privy to any inside information on Epstein's criminal case, a claim that would be refuted by federal prosecutors in court documents. Interestingly enough, the OPR would also decline to look into whether Michael Minchell, who helped literally negotiate Epstein's unprecedented sweetheart deal, had engaged in social and business relationships with Epstein, or that his relationship with one of Epstein's attorneys influenced his decisions in any way or should have been grounds for dismissal on grounds of conflict of interest. While Epstein's non-prosecution agreement satisfied the criminal charges, somehow, and granted immunity to all of his accomplices, both known and unknown, it left his victims without a say, as they weren't told about the deal until afterwards, and only 3 of the 34 identified victims who were willing to testify were even told the general terms of the agreement, and none of that was done until nearly a year after the fact. If anything, the MPA's supposedly generous compensatory provisions benefited Epstein more than his victims by limiting the amount of money that the victims could get, and gave blanket protection to everyone who helped Epstein. In 2010, as Epstein's probation ended, he was facing new problems as dozens of underage girls began filing federal civil lawsuits. One of them even challenged the legality of his NPA deal and threatened to put him in prison. Epstein would email Minchell, who was previously Acosta's criminal division chief and the conflict of interest guy, on February 22, 2011, saying, quote, "I'm going to have lunch with Acosta on Monday. Can we speak before? I can see you Sunday if you have time and inclination." Minchell would agree to speak by phone. In another letter to one of his lawyers, Martin Weinberg, Epstein would discuss the meeting and that Alan Dershowitz, the main negotiator of Epstein's sweetheart deal, would be attending as well. Acosta would later make a statement through his attorney, Jeffrey A. Nyman, that the meeting never happened. Alan Dershowitz would also claim it never happened. Even back while he was incarcerated, Epstein was influencing prosecutor Bruce Reinhardt, who, by the way, while still employed by the USAD's office, registered his own private practice at 250 S Australian Avenue, Suite 1400, West Palm Beach, which is not only the same address that another Epstein lawyer, Goldberger, was using, which he was close friends with, by the way, but is the exact same address for the Florida Science Foundation office that Epstein used while on work release. I swear you can't make this shit up. All of this is an incredibly tangled web, and it is only a very small snapshot of his vast network of associates and connections that he used to evade justice and continue abusing young girls along with his powerful buddies. Which, speaking of, in part 3, we'll be breaking down how the Epstein sex trafficking network most likely functioned, naming those who had a direct and irrefutable hand in it, and exposing details that I've only recently been able to uncover, details that may finally make sense of many of the darker elements of his entire case. So if you're enjoying this series, please do me a favor and make sure that you're following the show. Leave me a comment with your thoughts on all of it. But above all, meet me right back here in 2 weeks for part 3 of this series. I promise that it'll be worth it. Until then, though, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of one another when you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.